It has been 6 years since we've lost Steve Jobs, and I just want to take a few minutes to explain what Steve meant to me, because it was more than just being part of this huge company, this huge successful company. It was about making sure that things were done right the first time. And that sort of mantra, that sort of ethos does not represent Apple in its current state. Months before we lost Steve, at his, I believe it was his very last press conference, was for the iPad 2, he had this to say: "It is in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It is technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanity that yields us the results that make our hearts sing." When you have these two things merging, then you create a harmonization between hardware and software that would make millions of people want your device. And that was the thing about Steve. He knew how to make me want that product. And for me, that started with the iPod. The iPod always worked. It was just a music player, eventually a movie player as well. Only did those simple things, but it did them, and it did them well. And even if it had a problem and it stopped working, it was easy to fix it. Or if it couldn't be fixed, there was an easy way to deal with that issue as well. And, you know, you move into stuff like the iPhone and the iPod Touch, where you had, it could do more. It could do apps. It could do web browsing on top of the original core aspect of doing music. And it became more of a jack of all trades, master of everything. Whereas now we have a company that is trying to be a jack of all trades, but a master of none. I don't think that what Apple's doing now is necessarily the wrong thing. I just think they're making some poor decisions. And I see it in the devices that I use, the device that I use. In my time with Apple, I've only ever owned one Apple device at a time. I went from iPod Nano to iPod Touch to iPad to MacBook to iPad again. And I've watched that experience slowly become skewed. When I had my iPod, as I said, it just worked. And that was literally something that Steve always said: it just works. And I had my iPod Touch, and it just worked. I moved into the iPad during its 4th generation. It just worked. But then something happened. This iPad, yes, it was released after Steve had passed, but Apple was still sort of following that mantra of Steve, where, you know, technology and liberal arts must intertwine or you're not going to have a good experience. And I noticed that as time went on and Apple became sort of what people have labeled the new Apple, the experience changed and they started doing more things, and it started to function less. You know, Steve would have mass panic throughout the team because a gradient was off or a frame was dropped. And I can understand that, a frame drop here and there, that's fine. But as time went on, the operating system sort of became a slouch. And that's not something that Steve would stand for. If you look at the time that Steve was gone, and I'm not talking about from 2011 to now, I'm talking about when they fired him back in the 80s. If you look at that time period where he was gone, from the late 80s to the mid 90s, Apple tried to be a jack of all trades and a master of none. They tried to build anything and everything, license out anything and everything, and it didn't work. It put them in massive financial trouble. And then Steve came back, and suddenly everything was right again, because he came back, and for better or for worse, because Steve had his moods, it's all well documented. He had these moods, and it was the culmination of his harshness and his love and his passion for this, that everything had to work, and it had to work well. And with that time period that he was back up until a few years ago, it was like that. It was genuinely like that. Everything just worked. That was his mantra. It just works. And now, it kind of works. I'm not going to sit here and talk your ear off about frame drops and jank and whatnot, but when the operating system has problems where it just flat out doesn't work, when the hardware fails to intertwine with the software, that's a problem. And I know I sound like I'm the voice of the martyrs or whatever. I love Apple. I have for a very long time. It's no surprise to anyone for any reason. But when you don't have an experience that feels normal, that just works, you've created a disconnect between you and your user, and you don't want that. And without following that mantra that Steve, set in stone for so many years, Apple kind of loses something and becomes a shadow of their former selves. And that's what Steve meant to me. It wasn't about being a dick. It wasn't about creating these products. It was about creating an experience, because it's all about the experience. If I don't have a good experience, generally I don't want to go and re-experience that experience. If I have a terrible time on a roller coaster, I'm probably not going to get back on the damn thing. So if I have a bad experience with a phone or a tablet or a computer or any device, I'm probably not going to go back to that device. Or it would take some pretty hard coercing to convince me. So Steve was all about making sure that product was convincing, because it worked, and he knew it worked because he made sure that it would work, regardless of the effort that it would take, regardless of the hardship that it would take. And I think Apple needs to bring that back, because if they don't, they're just going to continue to be a shadow of their former selves. Yes, people are going to keep buying iPhones, iPads, Macs, whatever. They're going to keep buying Apple products in droves. But if you don't create meaningful experience you're going to lose a pretty loyal fan base pretty quick. And that truly is what Steve meant to me. Making sure that everything was done right. Making sure that it just works.